Hello, my ookie spookies. In today's video, I'm going to be trying out dip pens with ink for this illustration. I actually bought these nibs a couple of years ago and only tried them out once before, so I thought that it might be a really good time to finally get around to trying them out again and share my thoughts with you guys on how I feel about working with them. And as always, all of the art supplies I'll be using in today's video will be listed in the description down below. And before we get into the process of this illustration, I just wanted to quickly talk about the sponsor of today's video, which is Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community that offers thousands of classes for creative people on topics such as illustration, design, photography, freelancing, and more. As you guys know, I love experimenting with new art mediums, and I think that Skillshare is a great place to find classes from professionals that can guide you in the right direction in whatever creative endeavor you want to explore. Recently, as you guys might know, I've been quite busy, but the awesome thing about these classes is that they are broken down into manageable chapters that allow you to pick it up and put it down no matter what your schedule looks like. I definitely recommend checking out Charlie Clement's class for those of you who are looking to experiment with stylized portraits. She has great tips on finding inspiration from multiple reference photos and how you can implement them into your artwork. And I think a lot of the exercises within this class is a great way to try and figure out your voice and your style as an artist as well. So if you're interested, the first 1,000 people to use the link in my description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership. So many of you guys had guessed correctly last week based on my clue that this week's character would be from the Addams family. But I think the most popular character guess was actually Wednesday Addams, who I of course love, but I couldn't resist drawing the equally beloved Morticia Addams. The iteration that I am personally most familiar with is the films released in the early 90s, The Addams Family and Addams Family Values. So, of course, my main inspiration was Angelica Houston's portrayal of Morticia, but I was also very much inspired by Christina Ricci's take on Morticia as well. I particularly adore this super deep cut dress, and so I had to include that in my version. So, as I had mentioned at the beginning of the video, I have very little experience with dip pens. The first and only time I had tried using a dip pen was a couple of years ago, and I had used it quite sparingly for line art in a watercolor painting. I remember I had used cold press watercolor paper for that illustration, which is a textured paper, so using the dip pen on a textured surface was a little bit difficult. So for that reason, I chose to use a hot press watercolor paper this time so that I would be able to have a nice smooth surface for the nib to glide across. And similar to my previous video, I had sketched the illustration digitally on my iPad using Procreate. Then I printed it out using a light pad. I traced it onto this watercolor paper using a Faber-Castell polychromos colored pencil. I knew that I wasn't going to be using a huge amount of water, so I decided to only tape the top and the bottom of the paper down to the masonite board. I have also had issues with tape ripping this paper in the past, so I also made sure to kind of like pre-stick the tape to my pants a little bit to try and lose some of the tape's tackiness before laying it down on the paper. If you guys are familiar with my usual process, you'll probably know that I typically prefer to paint the illustration first and then add in the line art last. But for the sake of, trying out new things and experimenting, I decided to do the line art first, as well as try my hand at some more crosshatch shading, which is something that I also don't do very often either. Back when I was in high school and I was using fine liners for the first time, I used to do a lot of crosshatching for shading, but I kind of grew out of that, I guess, for a while. But it was fun. It was fun to just kind of revisit that and just try out something different from what I've typically been up to. Overall, I really enjoyed using the dip pen. I found that you're really able to have a lot of control and precision with it since the width of the line doesn't vary too much, which makes it much more predictable to work with. I find that when using a paintbrush or brush nib for line art, there definitely can be a more unpredictable result depending on how well you can control the pressure you put on using the tool. I often get a lot of questions about how I'm able to have so much control over my brushwork when doing little details, and most of the time it's because I'm holding onto the brush handle with an iron grip. But the problem with this is that my hand and wrist muscles can become quite cramped and sore if I'm working on a really small area for a very long time. And so I found that with this illustration, even though a lot of the process was detailed line work, I found that my hand didn't feel the same amount of fatigue that I normally would have when using a brush for the line art. I also found that the nib had a really good ink holding capacity, so I found that I didn't have to dip the nib into the ink quite as often as I probably would have when using a paintbrush. And I will say that there were a few moments when the ink would get a little bit clogged at the tip of the nib, but I found that as long as I cleaned it off with some water and a paper towel every so often, the flow of the ink was quite consistent. And of course, due to all of these elements, doing the line art for any small detailed areas was much easier, like the eyebrows and the necklace. So as you can see, at this point in the process, I decided to try and add in as much cross-hatching for the shading as I could. Like I mentioned before, this isn't a technique or style that I have used in quite a while, so I definitely think I was pretty inconsistent with how I was approaching it. Sometimes I was following the form of the element, like with the chair cushion, I was kind of using a curved line, and then some parts I was just going straight up and down. And so I think that in the end, this may have resulted in a bit of a messy and busy look for some areas, but I try not to sweat it too much since I knew I was planning to use some ink washes on top of it anyways. But I think if I were to approach this kind of method again, I would definitely try and be a little bit more sparing on how I approach the line work, or the cross hatching, I should say. Something that I think is worth mentioning that doesn't particularly bother me too much, but I can imagine would potentially bother other people, is that there definitely is a bit of a scratching sound as well as a kind of scratchy feel to using the dip pen. The sound, of course, would be much more noticeable when I was doing broader, quicker strokes, and the scratchy feel of the nib to paper, while wasn't super noticeable with this smooth paper, I can imagine that it might be much more noticeable on textured paper. Looking back at this footage, I think my favorite shading method that I used in this piece was how I did Morticia's dress on the arms and kind of upper torso. For these areas, I had mapped out the general shape of the shadow, and then I filled in the area with parallel diagonal lines. I find that this method looks much cleaner and intentional, so I think I will definitely be keeping that in mind if I try doing an illustration like this again. I find that, it just doesn't look quite as messy, and I think that the shading and the shadows look much more pronounced than some of the other areas like the hair or the cushion. So some of you may be wondering, why would I bother using a dip pen if I could just use a fine liner? While I do agree that they both achieve very similar looks, I did find that the dip pen was generally more satisfying to use. As well, depending on the nib and how much pressure you use, you can actually get varying line widths if you want to with a dip pen. Whereas typically with fine liners, you can really only achieve one line width at a time, which I find can look a little bit too cookie cutter or too clean for me. And so I like the option of having a little bit of more variation in my line width, which is the reason why I typically use a paintbrush. Then at this point in the process, I finally bust out my paintbrush and start painting in some ink washes to help reinforce the values of the piece and also to try and make the cross hatching feel a little less busy. So for the line work and dip pen, I was using the waterproof India ink. And then for these initial washes of ink with my brush, I had switched to the non-waterproof ink. I had never really used this non-waterproof ink before, and I found that it was really quite grainy, which was a texture that I both loved and hated at the same time. And something that you might be able to tell from the footage is that the ink sort of sits on top of the paper and floats around for a moment rather than actually being absorbed into the paper right away. This is part of the reason why I don't typically use hot press paper, because I find it difficult to paint on for this reason. So while the smooth paper was great for the dip pen, I didn't really love it for the painting portion. I also found that the non-waterproof ink, even when it was not diluted with water, I couldn't achieve really dark washes with it. So after the first layer, I ended up switching back to the waterproof India ink, which you can see me using here on the dress. And this was definitely kind of the turning point, I think, with the illustration, adding in the really dark darks on the dress. It really created a nice contrast and I think helped separate Morticia from the chair, which was something that I was having an issue with. I mean, it's definitely still not perfect, but I do think that working on this piece definitely reminded me that I still have a long way to go in terms of having good contrast on my values in my illustrations. Since I typically work in full color most of the time, I think that I'm relying on color to separate elements from each other in a piece. This also makes for a great example of why I always encourage you guys to try out new things and experiment, because even if it's not perfect or goes exactly the way that you hoped it would, the time and energy put into it will always still be worth it in the end, because you're still gaining a lot of knowledge, and the knowledge that you gain and learn from that mistake or, that failed attempt, you can put towards your next piece, and hopefully that will end up turning out better. So try not to get discouraged halfway through an illustration. It's usually worth seeing it to the end because you never really know what the outcome might be. Like with this Morticia piece, I definitely wouldn't say it's a failure, but I do see that there's still a lot of room to grow. I pretty much feel this way about all of my illustrations, but I typically don't mention it because that would just get really repetitive for you guys. Anyways, something that I noticed between these two inks that I was using, besides the graininess of the non-waterproof ink, was that the non-waterproof ink was actually a more cool black, whereas the waterproof India ink was a warm black. The warmth of the waterproof India ink was more obvious when I diluted it with water. I feel like it had almost a sepia tone to it, which I found really interesting. This may seem like totally arbitrary information, but I figured it was something worth mentioning because I know some people are very particular about those kinds of things. I actually did prefer the cooler grays of the non-waterproof ink, but because of the aforementioned things before about the graininess and just not getting those deep dark blacks, so having the slightly warmer black was a compromise I was willing to make to avoid the graininess and be able to achieve those really dark blacks, which I think really help make Morticia stand out, especially in her hair and the dress against the dark chair. And now we are on the home stretch of this painting, which is where I add in the red acrylic ink. As much as I try, I can never really seem to stay away from color. Plus, I think that adding in this red really helped bring this piece to life and just added another level of interest. So, as some of you may have already gathered, I am very much a millennial who thrives on the nostalgia of my youth. Sometimes this means I am kind of resistant to remakes of things that I loved growing up. Many of my childhood favorite animated films have been getting the live action remake treatment, aka all the Disney movies from the 90s, which I have not been particularly fond of, but interestingly enough, The Addams Family, which of course I recognize has had iterations before the 90s films, is a live action film that recently got an animated remake. I have not seen the new animated film, and honestly, I don't really recall hearing much buzz about it either, but feel free to let me know in the comments if you liked it and if you'd recommend me to check it out, because as you guys already know, I love animated films, and so I feel like this is a remake that I might actually enjoy. Anyways, in conclusion, I think that dip pens are a great alternative to brushes for doing your line art if you're looking for more control and precision. The downside is that I don't think that they are going to fare as well with textured paper, but that might be something I have to try out again in the future and let you guys know how that process works out for me. And that pretty much brings us to the finished piece. I hope that you enjoyed listening to my thoughts on this experimental illustration, and I hope that it encourages you guys to hopefully get out of your comfort zone in one way or another. Hi friends! I hope that you enjoyed this month's Halloween illustrations. We are down to the last one for next week, and so we are going to be ending the Halloween month with one of my favorite Halloween movies. And so the clue for that character is Red Bride. So let me know in the comments who you think this character is going to be, and I look forward to seeing you next week.